There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of a god that feeds on fear, something that grows stronger the more you dread it, something that exists because you exist, because you feel things, because somewhere deep inside the architecture of your consciousness there is rage and sorrow and desire and the cold animal terror of dying. The chaos gods of Warhammer 40,000 are built from all of that. They are not invaders from another dimension in the traditional sense. They are not alien beings that crept in from somewhere outside reality and set up camp in our nightmares. They are, in the most literal and most horrifying way possible, us. They are what happens when the collective psychic weight of every feeling ever felt by every sentient creature in the galaxy accumulates across millions of years inside a parallel dimension of pure emotion and slowly, inevitably, becomes self-aware. Khorne rose first, or at least rose earliest to his current terrible prominence, fed by the blood of countless wars stretching back through the age of humanity's most primitive ancestors. Every act of violence, every territorial dispute settled with a blade, every war fought for glory or land, or the sheer animal pleasure of domination, all of that poured into the warp and coalesced around a single burning point of will. He sits now on a throne of skulls that towers over a lake of blood, presiding over a domain of eternal slaughter, and he grows stronger with every death in real space, whether his followers deal it or his enemies do. Violence feeds him regardless of intent. He does not care why you kill. He cares only that you do. Every blade that has ever drawn blood across the billions of years of the galaxy's history of life has fed something into the warp, and that accumulated energy crystallized into Khorne. The blood god is the oldest and mightiest of the four, for reasons that make a terrible kind of sense. Violence is the most universal act of conscious life, the one behavior that spans every species, every culture, every level of technological development. Even the most enlightened civilization imaginable has some history of conflict. Even the most gentle being is capable of rage when sufficiently threatened. And so Khorne is built on the deepest and most ancient foundation of all four, sustained by an emotion that has been flowing into the warp since the first moment any living thing ever fought another over anything at all. He is not merely powerful, he is structural. He is embedded in the DNA of competition itself. Nurgle came from something quieter, and perhaps more universal, in a different way than rage. He came from the fear of death. Not the dramatic warrior's death on a battlefield, not the glorious sacrifice witnessed by comrades who will carry the story forward, but the small, mundane, biological terror that every living thing carries inside it without exception. The creeping awareness that flesh is fragile. That disease finds everyone eventually, regardless of wealth or power or virtue. That entropy does not negotiate and does not make exceptions for the deserving or the beloved or the genuinely good people who by any reasonable accounting should get more time. You can be a king or a beggar, and the process of decay does not care about the distinction. You can spend your entire life in service to others, and the cellular breakdown that defines aging will find you just as surely as it finds the most selfish person alive. Nurgle is the embodiment of that fear, and its strange twin, the acceptance that comes when the fear becomes too large to fight, the darkly paradoxical comfort of surrendering to the inevitable, rather than spending your remaining time fighting it with diminishing returns. He is simultaneously the most horrifying and the most paradoxically warm of the four. A grandfather figure rotting from the inside who genuinely believes he loves his followers, who gifts them with plagues that preserve their lives, even as they destroy everything that made those lives worth living. There is a terrible generosity to Nurgle that the other Chaos gods lack. He is the only one who actually seems to care about his followers in any recognizable sense, even if what he offers them is grotesque. It comes from something that resembles love. His realm in the warp is described as a garden, not a beautiful one in any conventional sense, but a garden nonetheless, full of things that grow and decay and grow again in cycles of grotesque fertility. Nurgle does not see this as repulsive, he sees it as natural. He is, in his own incomprehensible way, genuinely delighted by the creativity of decay. Tseentch is ambition and manipulation and the maddening promise of a better tomorrow that recedes the moment you reach for it. He is the chaos god of change, which sounds almost benign, until you realize that change, unchecked and purposeless, is just chaos by another name. Tzeentch spins plans within plans within plans, schemes so elaborate and nested and self-referential that they have long since ceased to serve any original purpose and now exist simply for the joy of scheming itself. His realm in the warp is a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of impossible geometry, where nothing stays the same for longer than a moment, where corridors become rooms, and rooms become open sky, and open sky becomes the interior of something that should not exist, and probably doesn't in any stable sense. He watches the mortal universe with eyes that see threads of fate stretching across time, every possible decision, creating a branching web of consequences that Tzeentch can perceive, with something approaching perfect clarity, and he delights in pulling those threads in directions that serve only his own incomprehensible amusement. He is the god who knows everything and cannot stop himself from meddling, not because he needs any particular scheme to succeed, but because the scheming itself is the point. There is a famous paradox embedded in Tzeentch's nature that scholars of the warp who survive long enough to appreciate it tend to find either darkly funny or quietly terrifying. He is the god of change, and yet the great game ensures that nothing fundamentally changes. He is the god of hope, and yet all hope under Tzeentch's attention eventually curdles into obsession and despair. He embodies the restless intelligence of ambition, applied without ethical compass and without any ultimate goal beyond its own perpetuation. The universe he inhabits is consequently one where ambition never achieves anything it originally intended, and where every plan that comes to fruition reveals itself as merely the precondition for a more complex plan that was always the real objective. Nothing in Tzeentch's realm ever arrives anywhere. It only ever moves. And then there is Slaanesh, the youngest and in many ways the most dangerous. The Dark Prince was born in a single cataclysmic moment, the fall of the Eldari, when an entire civilization's worth of unchecked desire and excess and cruelty and pleasure-seeking finally reached a critical mass, inside the warp, and screamed into existence. The birth of Slaanesh consumed most of the Eldari race in that first terrible breath. Billions of souls inhaled in an instant, pulled from bodies across interstellar distances, an entire galaxy-spanning civilization dying in the time it takes to draw a breath. The psychic shockwave of that birth tore a permanent wound in reality that we now call the Eye of Terror, a vast warp rift that has been a defining feature of the 41st millennium's geography ever since, a permanent scar on the face of space itself, where the material universe and the immaterium bleed into each other without resolution or comfort. Slaanesh feeds on obsession and sensation and the relentless pursuit of perfection, and the worst part is that the god makes it feel wonderful right up until the moment it destroys you completely. Where Khorne demands violence, and Nurgle demands surrender, and Tzeentch demands ambition, Slaanesh simply demands that you want something so much that you can think of nothing else. That wanting is what the Dark Prince consumes, and the wanting, as it always does, grows until it is larger than everything around it, until it is larger than you, until you are nothing but the wanting, until there is nothing left that Slaanesh has not already taken. These four entities are, by any reasonable measure, invincible. They cannot be killed in any conventional sense. They cannot be starved, because the emotions that feed them are fundamental to the nature of conscious life. As long as sentient creatures feel rage, Khorne endures. As long as living things fear death, Nurgle flourishes. As long as ambition and desire exist in any form, Tzeentch and Slaanesh persist. You cannot legislate these emotions out of existence. You cannot educate a species into perfect emotional neutrality without destroying what makes it sentient in the first place. The connections between consciousness, emotion, and psychic resonance in the warp are too deeply embedded in the architecture of mind itself to be eliminated without eliminating the mind along with them. These gods are, in the most technical and terrifying sense, functionally immortal. The Chaos gods are functionally immortal, precisely because mortality, with all its attendant anxiety and rage and longing, is the source of their power. And yet, there are things in this galaxy, forces and entities, and even simple facts about the nature of reality that make the Chaos gods flinch. There are scenarios that, if they came to pass, would diminish them, constrain them, or in some cases threaten something that functions very much like their destruction. The ruinous powers are not as untouchable as their titles suggest. They have vulnerabilities. They have fears. And exploring those fears tells us something fascinating, not just about the Chaos Gods themselves, but about the fundamental logic of the 40,000 universe, about what it takes to truly threaten something that exists outside of normal mortality, that feeds on suffering, and cannot be cut down by any blade. Each of these four beings is, in its own way, a perfect expression of an aspect of conscious experience that no amount of civilization or philosophy or moral progress can fully eliminate from the repertoire of what minds are capable of feeling, and that is why they endure. And that is why what threatens them is so specific and so strange and so worth understanding. We begin. We are going to walk through all of it. Every major threat, every quiet terror, every cosmic circumstance that gives even the most powerful entities in the Warhammer universe reason to be cautious. We are going to start with the most immediate and perhaps the most spectacular of those threats and work our way down into the deeper, stranger fears that the lore hints at in whispers and footnotes and moments of unexpected philosophical weight. Because this is a universe where even gods have nightmares, and understanding what haunts them tells us more about the shape of reality in the 41st millennium than almost anything else could. The Chaos Gods are products of a particular kind of universe. They are adapted, if that word means anything for beings of pure psychic energy, to a cosmos full of psychically active sentient life, generating continuous emotional output across vast timescales. Remove that universe, change its fundamental characteristics in certain very specific ways, and the Chaos Gods become something they have never had to be before: vulnerable. The armor of their apparent invincibility is the armor of circumstance, not of absolute nature. They are what they are because the conditions for what they are have persisted for millions of years, and those conditions are not guaranteed to persist forever. Not in a galaxy full of things that were ancient before the Chaos Gods were born and that carry weapons designed to silence the warp itself. So settle in. Let the darkness gather around you, and let's talk about what makes the Chaos Gods afraid. If you're watching this from somewhere interesting, drop your location and time in the comments below. I genuinely love seeing where in the world people are watching from, what hour it is, what the atmosphere is like wherever you are. And if this kind of deep lore content is what you're here for, subscribing means you won't miss what's coming next. Let us linger a moment longer on the nature of each dark god before moving forward, because the shape of their individual existences is what makes each of their specific fears intelligible. Khorne is not simply the god of violence in the abstract sense. He is the god of martial violence, specifically, of combat between conscious beings who choose to fight rather than flee. The blood he demands is the blood of warriors killed by other warriors. The skulls he collects are the skulls of those who died in battle, and the engine of his power runs not merely on death, but on the relationship between beings who raise weapons against each other and mean it. This distinction matters because it means that certain kinds of killing do not feed Khorne as efficiently as others. Slaughter of the helpless, the mechanical elimination of a population by a weapon that requires no fighter at all. These produce death, but not the specific quality of combat death that is Khorne's ideal sustenance. And it means that an enemy who cannot be fought in any meaningful way, an enemy that simply consumes without engaging in any kind of martial exchange, produces something unsatisfying to Khorne, even while it is destroying everything around it. The Tyranids feed something in Khorne when they fight Space Marines or Imperial Guard or anyone who fights back with genuine martial will. But when they consume a city that has no warriors left to defend it, when they strip a world clean with no real opposition, the death they produce is not blood and skulls in the Khornate sense. It is simply biomass being processed, and Khorne has no more use for processed biomass than a fire has for water. Nurgle's relationship with his own power is worth examining in similar detail because it illuminates one of the darkest aspects of what he represents. He is not the god of death exactly. He is the god of the fear of death and, crucially, of the acceptance that follows it. The cycle of despair to surrender that lies at the heart of Nurgle's worship is one that requires time to complete. You cannot rush someone from existential dread to the Papa Nurgle's peculiar comfort in a single afternoon. The process of Nurgle's corruption is slow by design, because the emotional journey he exploits is a slow one. Plague does not merely kill. It wastes, lingers, prolongs, removes hope incrementally across weeks or months of increasing suffering. The long despair of a dying population is far more useful to Nurgle than the sudden elimination of that same population by weapons that provide no time for dread to develop. He is, in his own diseased way, a connoisseur of suffering's pacing. This is another reason the Tyrannid threat is so specifically hostile to Nurgle's interests. The Tyrannids do not pace their consumption in ways that allow despair to fully develop and sustain itself. The final stages of a Tyrannid invasion are typically too swift for the lingering, season-long suffering that Nurgle prefers. The terror that precedes them, the knowledge that the fleet is coming, that the planet has been targeted, that the choice is flee or die, does feed Nurgle to some extent. But the complete elimination of the planetary population before the corruption can deepen and mature and ripen into the full flower of Nurglan acceptance cuts the process short in a way that produces far less psychic yield than a properly managed plague year, spreading across a continent with adequate communication networks to let the news of the dying travel ahead of the dying itself. Tzeentch's particular vulnerability is different from the other three, and perhaps the most philosophically interesting. He is the god of plans and knowledge and the manipulation of fate's threads, and his power grows with ambition and scheming and the hope of changing one's circumstances through cleverness and application of will. But ambition requires a future to aim at. Scheming requires a situation complex enough to be worth scheming about. The manipulation of fate requires a fate with enough threads to provide purchase for manipulation. Take away the complexity, simplify a situation into pure consumption, with no strategic texture, no faction dynamics, no competing interests that can be played against each other, and Tzeentch finds himself in a universe that has gone, from his perspective, featureless and dull. The Tyrannid hive mind does not scheme. It does not have ambitions that can be redirected or deceived. It does not form alliances that can be broken or agreements that can be violated. It is a single will expressed through billions of bodies, and it does not produce the kind of complicated, multi-layered situations that Tzeentch was built to exploit. It produces biomass consumption. There is nothing for Tzeentch to do with biomass consumption, except watch it happen with something that, in a being capable of ordinary frustration, would be called frustration. And Slaanesh. We will spend more time on Slaanesh when we discuss Yniad, but here it is worth noting the specific quality of Slaanesh's sustenance and how narrowly it is calibrated. The Dark Prince feeds on sensation and pleasure, and the obsessive pursuit of perfect experience. Not merely sensation in general, not every experience of every kind registers equally for Slaanesh. The highest quality sustenance comes from the most psychically resonant, most sophisticated, most deeply felt experiences. An Ealdari's joy or grief or pleasure is worth vastly more to Slaanesh than an Orc's equivalent experience, because the Ealdari's psychic resonance is so much higher. A human noble's elaborate sensory indulgence is worth more than a conscript's simple fear, because the complexity of the experience maps more cleanly onto the frequencies Slaanesh was built to consume. The Dark Prince is, in the most literal sense, a gourmet of consciousness, not merely hungry for sensation, but specifically hungry for the most refined and intense and psychically rich versions of sensation that exist. This means that events which reduce the overall quality of conscious experience in the galaxy, which eliminate the most complex and sophisticated species and leave behind simpler ones, or which eliminate all complex experience in favor of pure survival, are bad for Slaanesh in a specific way. The Tyrannids, again, present this problem with particular clarity. An Aeldari world consumed by the Great Devourer is an Aeldari world whose population, the most prized food source in Slaanesh's entire cosmology, has been eliminated, not converted to chaos, not corrupted toward the kind of refined, intricate sensory experiences that Slaanesh best exploits, simply consumed. The biomass is gone, the souls are gone. The galaxy's supply of Slaanesh's preferred sustenance is permanently reduced. and there is nothing the Dark Prince can do about it. The four Chaos Gods are extraordinarily powerful within the specific parameters of their existence. But those parameters are narrower than they appear from outside, and the universe in the 41st millennium is producing threats that exploit those parameters in ways the Dark Gods were never designed to handle. Section 2. The nature of fear in the warp, and how even gods can tremble. Before we can properly understand what the Chaos Gods fear, we need to understand what fear actually means for an entity like them, because these are not beings that experience emotion the way mortals do. They are not gods in the sense of benevolent or even malevolent personalities, sitting somewhere up in the clouds, making conscious decisions about your fate in between their morning coffee and their afternoon meetings. They are vast, partially self-aware accumulations of psychic energy that have, over millions of years, developed something that functions like a personality, something that functions like desire, something that functions like strategic intelligence, and something that functions like the drive for self-preservation. That last part is crucial, self-preservation, because the Chaos Gods, for all their apocalyptic power, are not truly eternal in the way the word is casually used. They persist because the conditions for their persistence persist. They exist because the emotions that created them continue to be generated by mortal life throughout the galaxy. Remove those conditions, change those circumstances in certain very specific ways, and you threaten not just the power of the Dark Gods, but their actual continued existence. A flame needs fuel. It does not matter how large or how hot the flame has grown if the fuel runs out. The Chaos Gods are the most magnificent flames in the history of the galaxy, and the fuel is everything sentient and feeling. The warp, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, whatever name you prefer for that churning dimension of pure psychic energy that exists beneath and around and within normal reality, it is not a stable environment. It is a reflection of mortal consciousness, and mortal consciousness is wildly, violently unstable. When a civilization on some distant world tears itself apart in civil war, you can feel the echo of that violence in the warp as a surge of turbulent psychic energy, a ripple in the Imperium that strengthens Khorne's realm and empowers his servants in the material world. When a plague sweeps across a densely populated planet and billions of people spend their final hours in terror and despair, Nurgle's realm blooms, with new growth, strange flowers emerging from the psychic resonance of collective suffering, his garden expanding in ways that would be beautiful if beauty weren't so deeply inadequate a word for what happens there. When an empire rises and a new generation throws itself into the pursuit of power and knowledge, Tzeentch watches the threads of fate shifting and schemes accordingly. The warp is a mirror held up to the galaxy's emotional life, and in that mirror the Chaos Gods see their own reflection growing stronger or weaker as the fortunes of mortal civilizations rise and fall. Every act, every emotion, every prayer and scream and desperate thought from every psychically resonant creature in the galaxy ripples into the warp and contributes to the ever-shifting balance of power among the ruinous powers. This is both their greatest strength and, as we will explore, their most fundamental vulnerability. They are sustained by mortal life. They are shaped by mortal life. And in ways that the dark poetry of the 40,000 setting makes clear, they are threatened by the particular patterns and absences of mortal life, just as surely as any living creature is threatened by starvation. The Chaos Gods are enormously powerful, but a living thing that cannot find its food starves, regardless of how powerful it is. A being of psychic energy that cannot find its specific emotional sustenance diminishes regardless of how vast it has grown. This is not a comforting thought. It is not a reassurance that everything will be fine. It is simply a fact about the architecture of these entities that opens the door to understanding what can actually threaten them. The great game that occupies most of the Dark Gods' attention is built on this dynamic. The four Chaos Gods fight each other in an eternal, constantly shifting conflict, not just because they are different entities with different goals, but because each of them is in constant competition for the psychic energy that flows in from the mortal realm. When Khorne's power rises, which happens whenever violence becomes widespread and dominant across the galaxy, the other three gods collectively lose ground because the balance of emotional energy has tilted toward rage and bloodshed and away from the fear and ambition and desire that sustain the other three. When Nurgle's influence expands during great plagues, during periods of mass despair and civilizational collapse, the other three push back, weakening his hold when they can, steering events in the mortal realm toward outcomes that produce different emotional resonance. They are farmers competing for the same field, each one trying to grow the crop that feeds their particular form of existence, while preventing the others from crowding them out. The Great Game is therefore not merely a theological turf war between incompatible ideologies, as it might superficially appear. It is an existential struggle for the very substance of their being, and this is where the nature of what they fear becomes clearer. They do not fear pain in the way a mortal fears pain. They do not have nervous systems or biological alarm systems. They do not fear loss in the way a person fears losing something they love. What they fear, if we can use that word at all, for entities whose experience of reality is so alien to our own, is diminishment, reduction, the slow or sudden shrinking of their power and influence in a way that threatens their ability to sustain their own existence. They fear becoming less. They fear the possibility of becoming so much less that they cease to be entirely. There is something else worth understanding about the Chaos Gods and their relationship to threat. In the lore, it is emphasized repeatedly that these entities are fundamentally monomaniacal. They are formed entirely from a single concept or emotion, and that formation shapes everything about how they perceive and interact with reality. Khorne can, in a sense, only see the galaxy through the lens of violence. Every event is processed as either an opportunity for slaughter or an obstacle to slaughter. Nurgle perceives everything through the lens of decay and acceptance. His warmth and his horror are two sides of the same profound engagement with entropy. Tzeentch sees only the threads of fate and the opportunities for manipulation. Slaanesh perceives only sensation and the promise of its intensification. This monomaniacal nature means that when the Chaos Gods are presented with threats that fall outside their conceptual framework and things they were never designed to understand or respond to, they are at a disadvantage that no amount of raw power can easily compensate for. A threat that doesn't look like anything Khorne understands is harder for him to respond to than a threat 10 times more powerful that looks like a battle he knows how to fight. A force that generates no psychic resonance that Slaanesh can feed on or manipulate is more dangerous to the Dark Prince than a straightforwardly hostile army of 1,000,000 warriors, because the army at least provides the satisfaction of sensation in the fighting. The Chaos Gods are powerful, but they are also, in this very specific sense, limited. Their power comes with a particular shape, and threats that don't fit that shape are threats they are disproportionately poorly equipped to handle. They are optimized for a very specific kind of universe, and the universe has a habit of producing things they were not optimized for. With that understanding in place, let us begin exploring the specific things that genuinely threaten them. The concept of the Great Game itself, that eternal, structuring competition between the four Chaos Gods, deserves one more careful look before we proceed, because it is not merely a theological curiosity or a backdrop for narrative conflict. It is the organizing principle of everything chaos does in the mortal realm, and understanding it fully is essential for understanding why the threats we are about to examine are as serious as they are. The Great Game was not designed. It was not established by any conscious decision or agreed upon by the four dark gods as a framework for their interactions. It emerged, the way everything in the warp emerges, from the nature of the entities involved and the environment they inhabit. Four beings of pure psychic energy, each one embodying a specific and in some ways mutually exclusive emotional principle, each one feeding from the same broad pool of mortal psychic output, each one with the will and the power to influence events in the material realm in ways that favor their own growth. The conflict between them is not a choice, it is a consequence. You cannot have four such entities sharing the same environment and not have them in permanent competition, any more than you can have four fires burning in the same room without them competing for the same air. What this means structurally is that the Chaos Gods have never, in the entire history of their existence, been able to act with unified purpose for any sustained period. The Horus Heresy represents perhaps the closest they have come, a 10,000-year engineering project that required all four of them to work, loosely and intermittently, toward a common objective. And even that fractured almost immediately after its completion, with the heresy's aftermath producing exactly the kind of chaotic fragmentation that was inevitable once the shared objective was achieved. The legions split. The successors chose different patrons. The Eye of Terror became home to thousands of competing warbands, with thousands of incompatible agendas. The unity dissolved the moment the need for it dissolved, and the great game resumed its normal patterns, with all of the intensity that 10,000 years of enforced partial cooperation had suppressed. This has a direct bearing on how the Chaos Gods respond to the multiple threats converging on them in the current era. The Tyrannid threat cannot be addressed by any single Chaos God acting unilaterally. It is too large, too pervasive, too utterly indifferent to the specific domains of any one dark god. An effective response would require the 4 Chaos Gods to coordinate their servants, their daemonic hosts, their warp-based interference with mortal events, in ways that prioritized opposing the Tyrannids over competing with each other. And the Great Game makes this essentially impossible. Not difficult, impossible, in the way that asking water to flow uphill is impossible, not a matter of insufficient effort, but of the fundamental nature of the thing. Khorne's servants fight everyone, including each other. Tzeentch's servants pursue plans that serve Tzeentch, regardless of whether they help or hinder the broader anti-Tyrannid effort. Nurgle's plagues do not distinguish between Tyrannid victims and the populations that would otherwise provide psychic sustenance. Slaaneish's followers are fully occupied with the quality of their own sensation. The 4 Chaos Gods cannot mount a coordinated defense of the conditions of their own existence. This is the Great Game's final and most devastating expression as a structural vulnerability. And we will begin with the most viscerally spectacular of those threats, the one that the setting itself has identified as uniquely positioned to destabilize everything the Chaos Gods have built across millennia of patient exploitation. The one that comes from outside the galaxy entirely, preceded by something that the warp has no category for: the sound of absolute silence. Section 3. The Great Devourer. Why Tyrannids are an existential nightmare for chaos. Imagine you are a being of pure psychic energy. Your entire existence depends on the constant flow of emotion from the mortal realm, the rage and fear and desire and despair of billions of conscious creatures, generating the psychic output that you breathe and drink and grow from. You have existed for tens of thousands of years drawing on this limitless resource. The galaxy is full of life in every direction. Humans, Ildari, orcs, Tau, and countless minor species scattered across 100,000 star systems, all of them feeling, all of them generating the psychic resonance that sustains you. The supply seems inexhaustible. The Great Game continues its eternal patterns. The mortal realm writhes and suffers and strives, and you feed, and everything is as it has always been. And then, from somewhere beyond the edge of the galaxy, something approaches, something enormous, something that moves through space in fleets so massive that they blot out the stars between worlds. Biological ships larger than moons, creatures the size of city blocks moving through the void, an interconnected swarm of billions of organisms sharing a single vast and alien mind, consuming everything in their path with the thoroughness of fire through dry grass. Something that has one purpose and one purpose only: to consume every scrap of organic matter on every world it touches, to strip planets down to bare rock, to leave nothing behind but sterile silence and cooling stone. And here is the part that makes even the Chaos Gods uneasy. As this thing approaches, it does not generate the psychic resonance you feed on. It does not feel rage or fear or desire or despair in any way that registers meaningfully in the warp. It is a mind, a single collective intelligence, called the hive mind, but it is a mind that exists outside the warp entirely. It does not dip into that dimension for sustenance or power. It does not use the Imperium for travel the way so many other species do. It exists in real space alone, thinking thoughts that are purely physical and purely biological, driven by an appetite that is purely material, generating a psychic signature that is not the warm, bright glow of emotional life, but something cold and strange and utterly alien to everything the Chaos Gods were designed to perceive and exploit. This is the Tyrannid hive mind, and it brings with it, preceding its fleets like a storm front rolling before a hurricane, a phenomenon called the shadow in the warp. The Warhammer 40K wiki describes it as a smothering psychic signal, similar to white noise, that envelops entire star systems and disrupts all forms of warp travel and communication. Swallowed up by psychic static, whole worlds suddenly go deathly silent, giving no clues as to what is unfolding on the surface below. The silence is the announcement. By the time anyone understands what it means, the invasion is already over. The shadow in the warp is perhaps the most elegant and most terrifying weapon in the Tyranid arsenal, and the important thing to understand about it is that it is not a weapon at all in any deliberate sense. No Tyranid creature decided to deploy it strategically. It is simply a natural consequence of the hive mind's existence, the overwhelming psychic signature of an intelligence of incomprehensible scale pressing against the boundary between real space and the immaterium and producing something that functions like white noise across every psychic frequency simultaneously. The hive mind's thoughts are so vast, so alien, so utterly incompatible with the warp's existing structures that their mere proximity disrupts the immaterium the way a massive electromagnetic pulse disrupts electronics, not through targeted attack, but through the simple physics of incompatible forces occupying the same space. For psychers, the shadow is something far worse than mere interference. It floods their minds with the formless, predatory hunger of the hive mind, drowning out their ability to perceive or draw upon the warp, driving many into madness or death as their psychic senses are overwhelmed by something they have no framework to process. Astropaths, the specially trained telepaths the Imperium relies on entirely for long-range communication between star systems, are struck completely mute under the shadow's influence. Their messages simply stop. Worlds fall silent with no warning. And by the time anyone in the wider Imperium understands that the silence is permanent, there is nothing left to rescue. The fleet has moved on, and the world is already stripped. But the shadow does not only affect psychers and communications, it affects the warp itself. When a Tyranid fleet moves through a region of space, the immaterium in that region is suppressed, compressed, pushed back against the dimensional boundary. Demonic incursions become more difficult, then essentially impossible as the fleet density increases. The power of chaos psychers falters. The servants of the ruinous powers find their gifts weakening, their connections to their patrons growing uncertain, the whispered promises of their dark masters falling into a static silence they have never experienced before and were never prepared for. Anima Roleplay's Tyranid Lore Guide notes that the Shadow's psychic blackout is so total that even the daemons of the Chaos Gods are unnerved by it, recoiling from a presence that seems to consume the very warp from which they are made. Daemons, beings made of the immaterium, existing in and through the warp, are unnerved by something that treats their home dimension as an obstacle to be suppressed rather than a resource to be used. And the Chaos Gods themselves? They cannot see clearly through the shadow. Their perception of the mortal realm, always imperfect and filtered through the chaos of the warp, becomes further obscured as hive fleets advance. Entire star systems, consumed by Tyranid fleets, vanish from their sight as surely as if someone had turned off the lights. The psychic energy those systems would have generated the ongoing output of billions of conscious, feeling, psychically resonant beings simply stops flowing into the warp. It is cut off, devoured, along with everything else, not redirected, not transformed, simply gone. Now multiply that across hundreds of worlds. Multiple hive fleets are pressing into the galaxy simultaneously. Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and others attacking from different vectors across the galactic plane. Each one strips worlds clean. Each consumed planet is a planet that no longer generates psychic resonance. Each eliminated species is a species whose emotional life no longer sustains the immaterium. The cumulative effect across decades and centuries is a galaxy that is progressively quieter in the specific psychic frequencies the Chaos Gods depend on. In the most extreme theoretical version, if the Tyranids were to consume all life in the Milky Way galaxy, the warp would eventually return to a state of near stasis. A calm, undifferentiated sea of psychic energy, with nothing to stir it, nothing feeding the entities that have grown so vast within it. And the Chaos Gods, their food source eliminated, would diminish towards something approaching non-existence. Not death, in any conventional sense, but something functionally close to it. There is a deeply strange irony embedded in this dynamic. The Chaos Gods, who represent the darkest aspects of conscious life, who have built their entire existence on the exploitation of mortal suffering, find themselves in the uncomfortable position of actually needing that mortal life to continue. They need humanity to keep fighting and dying in desperate wars. They need the Eldari to keep surviving at the very edge of extinction. They need the orcs to keep crashing through the galaxy in enthusiastic violence. Without the emotional output of those species, the dark gods would simply fade. The Tyranids do not care about any of this. The hive mind does not negotiate. It does not threaten or bargain or offer dialogue. It simply consumes. And the perfect mindlessness of that consumption, the absolute biological indifference of an intelligence that feels nothing the Chaos Gods can relate to or use, makes it uniquely and perfectly threatening to them. The shadow in the warp does not bow to the ruinous powers. It does not strengthen them or feed them or acknowledge their existence in any meaningful way. It simply rolls over their realm of influence, and where it passes, the Chaos Gods find themselves operating blind, reaching for a food supply that is no longer there. One more dimension of the Tyranid threat is worth examining before we move past it. The question of what the Chaos Gods can actually do about the Tyranids, and why the answer is so unsatisfying from their perspective. The conventional tools of chaos corruption involve finding a vulnerability in a target's psychology and exploiting it. Fear, ambition, grief, despair, pride, all of these are entry points. The Chaos Gods are extraordinarily patient and creative in finding and widening these entry points in any consciousness they can reach. They have corrupted Space Marine chapters. They have turned planetary governors. They have subverted entire imperial institutions from the inside over the course of centuries. None of this applies to the hive mind. You cannot bribe a consciousness with no concept of personal interest. You cannot threaten a mind that does not experience fear in any psychically resonant form. You cannot divide and conquer a distributed intelligence where the destruction of individual components does not weaken the collective will. You cannot seduce something that experiences no desire beyond the biological imperative to consume and reproduce. The hive mind is not merely resistant to these approaches. It is impervious to them in a way that is absolute and structural rather than merely difficult to overcome with sufficient effort. There are accounts in the lore, rare, contested, treated with skepticism by most authorities, of attempts by chaos forces to interact with Tyranid bioforms in various ways. Demonic entities that tried to possess or influence Tyranid creatures found themselves either simply expelled or, more disturbingly, in some accounts, absorbed into the shadow in the warp in ways that were more damaging to the daemon than to the Tyranid. The hive mind's psychic field does not simply reject demonic influence the way a warded surface might. It processes and neutralizes it in a way that suggests the Tyranid system has encountered and dealt with psychic, hostile contacts before, perhaps long before it reached the Milky Way galaxy. Whatever the hive mind has faced in the intergalactic void between galaxies, across distances that dwarf anything in the 41st millennium's experience of scale, it has apparently encountered forms of psychic opposition and developed mechanisms to handle them. Chaos is not the first psychic force it has met, and it is not the most dangerous thing it has ever consumed. This is the dimension of the Tyranid threat that is hardest to sit with comfortably. The hive mind is not just a threat to the galaxy's mortal life. It is a threat that has crossed intergalactic space, that has traveled distances measured in millions of light years to reach the Milky Way, which implies a scale of operation and a history of successful consumption that suggests the galaxy's current inhabitants, including the Chaos Gods, are not the most formidable things the Great Devourer has ever encountered. Whatever the hive mind found across the void, it consumed it, and then it came here. The laughter of the thirsting gods sounds less certain when you hold that thought for a moment. Section 4. The Necrons and the Silence of the Warp. Ancient technology that chokes the Imperium. If the Tyranids represent a biological, unintentional threat to the Chaos Gods, a force that simply happens to suppress and consume the conditions necessary for the dark powers to thrive, then the Necrons represent something different, and in some ways, more disturbing. The Necrons are a civilization that once waged war, specifically against the entities that preceded and in some ways created the conditions for the Chaos Gods. They built weapons explicitly designed to suppress and negate psychic energy on a massive scale. And they left behind an infrastructure of anti-warp technology scattered across the galaxy that continues to operate millions of years after its creators went into stasis. The Necrons are the most ancient civilization in the known galaxy that remains active in any meaningful sense. 60 million years ago, they were the Necron tier, a mortal race cursed with horrifically short lives due to the radiation of their home star, a people consumed by resentment at the injustice of brief existence in a universe that seemed to care nothing for their suffering. They made a deal with beings called the Satan, the star gods, ancient entities of living energy, who had been present since the universe's early cooling, who helped the Necron tier transfer their consciousnesses into immortal metal bodies, in a process called the biotransference. The price was everything organic, the biological connection to the warp that all sentient life maintains, that subtle, constant relationship between consciousness and the Imperium, was severed absolutely. The Necron tier became the Necrons, beings of living metal, immortal, and utterly cut off from the Imperium. This made them completely immune to chaos. You cannot corrupt something that has nothing for chaos to take hold of. Daemons cannot possess a Necron because there is no psychic substance within one for a daemon to inhabit, no soul signature in the warp for a daemonic entity to lock onto. The promises of the ruinous powers have no purchase on creatures that feel no desire, no fear, no ambition, no despair in any form that registers in the warp. The Chaos Gods look at a Necron and see, to the extent they see anything at all, nothing. A void where a soul should be. But the Necrons went further than simply being immune. During the War in Heaven, that ancient conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrons and their Cetan overlords, they developed technology specifically designed to suppress and negate psychic energy on a massive scale. The Old Ones had created many of the galaxy's psychically active species as weapons in this war. The Necrons, unable to fight fire with psychic fire given their own complete separation from the Imperium, responded by building devices that could extinguish that fire entirely, that could reach into the warp's relationship to real space and cut the cord between them at the local level. The most famous examples of this technology that still exist in the 41st millennium are the pylons, massive structures of a substance the Necrons call noctilith, with negatively, empirically charged properties that dampen the effects of the warp. The Warhammer 40K wiki's entry on Cadian pylons describes them as acting essentially as anti-psychic field emitters, restricting the activity of the Imperium in proximity to them. The pylons on Cadia, more than 5,000 of them above the surface, each one 500 meters tall, with thousands more partially buried by millions of years of tectonic movement, held the Eye of Terror in check for tens of thousands of years. This vast warp rift, born from the fall of the Eldari, would, without intervention, have continued expanding across real space indefinitely. The pylons contained it, maintained a corridor of navigable space around it, significantly limited daemonic crossings into the surrounding galaxy. When Belisarius Cawl activated the full pylon network during the 13th Black Crusade, the Cadian Sector Wiki records something remarkable. Even the Eye of Terror began to shrink as it was struck by the pylon's anti-psychic emissions. Abaddon the Despoiler, who had been pushing through Cadia with seemingly unstoppable momentum, abandoned primary objectives specifically to prevent Cawl from completing the activation. The Blackstone fortress that finally destroyed Cadia did so not simply because Abaddon wanted to annihilate the world, but because destroying Cadia was the only reliable way to destroy the pylon network before it could undo everything the 13th Black Crusade was designed to achieve. The pylons were Abaddon's greatest obstacle, not the Space Marines, not the Imperial Guard, who fought and died by the millions. The pylons, pieces of ancient Necron technology, sitting quietly in the ground for millions of years, still doing their job. Consider what that means from the Chaos Gods' perspective. These structures were built before the Chaos Gods existed in their current form. They were built by a civilization that has since gone to sleep in tombs scattered across the galaxy. A civilization that could wake up, is waking up, slowly and unevenly, with all of its knowledge intact and all of its hostility to psychic entities undiminished. The Pariah Nexus is another expression of this in the current era. A Necron operation, deploying anti-psychic devices so thorough that not only demons, but even the psyker abilities of Space Marines, are completely eliminated within its boundaries. The region has been scrubbed of warp activity in a way that no amount of faith or firepower could replicate. The broader Necron awakening, now underway across hundreds of tomb worlds simultaneously, represents a potentially civilization-scale escalation of this technology. The pylons on Cadia were ancient and passive machines, running their original programming without any active intelligence directing them. The Necrons awakening in the 41st millennium are neither passive nor working from limited information. They carry the full weight of 60 million years of technological development and a bone-deep hostility towards psychic life that predates the Chaos Gods themselves by more than half the age of the current universe. The Chaos Gods cannot corrupt the Necrons. They cannot intimidate them. They cannot offer them anything meaningful, because what the Necrons want, the revival of their civilization, the reclamation of the galaxy they once dominated, is fundamentally incompatible with everything chaos represents. The Necrons are not merely resistant to chaos. They are, at the level of their fundamental technology and their entire civilizational purpose, anti-chaos. They are a civilization-scale antibody against the very forces the Dark Gods embody. And they are waking up. Across hundreds of worlds, in tombs that have been silent for 60 million years, the lights are coming back on, and the Chaos Gods can do nothing about it. Section 5. The Emperor. The Anathema on the Golden Throne. There is a figure in the Warhammer 40,000 universe who is described, in the language of chaos itself, as the Anathema. Not an enemy in the way the Necrons are enemies, not a force of technology or military opposition. An antithesis, something so fundamentally opposed to the nature of the Chaos Gods, that simply existing in active opposition to them constitutes a kind of ongoing attack on their being. A wound that never heals, because the source of the wounding never goes away. That figure is the Emperor of Mankind, and he has been sitting on the golden throne of Terra for over 10,000 standard years, not quite alive, not quite dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day, a shattered god machine of almost incomprehensible psychic power, pouring that power simultaneously in multiple directions. Outward, maintaining the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that allows Imperial ships to navigate the warp across the vast distances of the galaxy, the beacon without which the entire Imperium of man would fragment and collapse within generations. And inward, holding shut a breach in reality beneath the throne itself, where the unfinished Imperial Webway project left a wound in space that would, if left unguarded, allow daemons to pour directly into the heart of Terra. The Chaos Gods and the daemons of the warp refer to the Emperor by a title, the Anathema. The Warhammer 40K wiki records that the Emperor is described as the greatest embodiment of universal order in the galaxy today and the most potent foe of chaos in existence. Not a threat, not a rival. An antithesis, something that opposes, by its fundamental nature. His psychic lighthouse burns constantly in the immaterium, a point of order in a sea of disorder, a focused and purposeful psychic emission that cuts through the swirling madness of the warp and creates something the Chaos Gods cannot abide: clarity, purpose. The active suppression of demonic activity in the surrounding regions of the warp. The Emperor's will, projected outward through the Astronomicon and through his broader psychic presence, maintains Terra as an extraordinarily difficult target for demonic incursion and holds the line every hour of every day of every year of the 10,000 years since his body was destroyed. The Emperor was, in life, the most powerful human psyker who had ever existed. A perpetual who had walked the earth for nearly 50,000 years, dying and reincarnating repeatedly, accumulating psychic power and knowledge across countless lifetimes. During the Great Crusade, he had a plan with specific and terrifying implications for the Chaos Gods. He would construct a network of tunnels through the Webway, the ancient dimensional highway built by the Eldari, and route humanity's interstellar travel and communication through that safer medium. The Webway was psychically insulated. Daemons could not freely enter it. The Chaos Gods had no meaningful purchase within it. A humanity that traveled through the Webway rather than through the raw warp would, over centuries and millennia, become progressively less dependent on the Immaterium in ways that would begin to starve the Dark Gods of one of their most significant sources of sustenance. The Chaos Gods understood this plan. They feared it enough to engineer one of the most elaborate and destructive operations in the history of the galaxy to destroy it. They corrupted Horus, the War Master. They used Magnus the Red's misguided psychic intrusion as a weapon to break the wards around the Imperial Webway project, allowing a demonic incursion that trapped the Emperor on the throne. They engineered the confrontation on the Vengeful Spirit, where the Emperor faced his broken son and chose to reach for the man rather than simply destroy the monster, and paid for that mercy with his body. But they did not kill him, and in surviving, he continues to function as the anathema. There is something more that the Chaos Gods may fear even more than the Emperor's current state. There are persistent threads in the lore, suggesting that the Emperor is not merely maintaining, he is changing. 10,000 years of psychic accumulation, the sacrifice of 1,000 souls every day, the slow crystallization of a consciousness that has had 50,000 years of mortal life, and 10,000 years of something beyond it. These things may be building toward a genuine ascension. Not the Emperor returning to life in any conventional sense, but the Emperor becoming a warp god of his own. The Warhammer Guild's Emperor Lore Guide notes that some theologians within the Imperium believe the Emperor is slowly becoming a full warp god, something that transcends the Chaos Gods entirely. An entity aligned entirely against chaos, operating at the level of the ruinous powers, built from the most powerful psychic mind in human history. The Chaos Gods know this is possible. It is why they celebrate his current state, not his survival exactly, but his stasis. The throne, as it currently functions, is the worst of both worlds for humanity, but a satisfying compromise for chaos. The Emperor constrained is not the Emperor destroyed. He cannot act or lead or transform in the way he might if whole. But he does not fully die either, which means he cannot ascend in the way that would be catastrophic for them. The Golden Throne is Chaos's greatest victory and its most persistent anxiety simultaneously. The technology is failing, the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers is barely adequate, and the question of what happens when it finally stops working is one that the Chaos Gods contemplate with something that is not quite confidence and is not quite dread, but sits uncomfortably between both. Section 6, The Great Game, The Curse of Winning. Here is a paradox that sits at the very foundation of what the Chaos Gods are, something so fundamental to their nature that it is easy to overlook when focusing on the surface spectacle of 40,000, but impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. The Chaos Gods cannot win, not in the sense that the forces of order will necessarily defeat them. The lore is clear that this is not guaranteed, but in a deeper, more fundamental sense, a complete victory for any one of the Dark Gods, or for all of them collectively, would be directly and immediately self-destructive. The conditions required for chaos to achieve total dominion over reality are precisely the conditions that would make it impossible for chaos to continue existing afterward. Here is the mechanism in its full detail. The Chaos Gods exist because mortal beings feel things. The emotional output of mortal consciousness is what the Chaos Gods are made of and what they require to sustain themselves. Remove that output and they diminish. Eliminate it entirely and they cease. Now consider what complete chaos victory would actually look like. If the warp were to fully subsume real space, if the dimensional barriers were to collapse entirely, if the material universe were to dissolve into the churning madness of the immaterium, there would be no more mortal life, no more planets with populations generating emotional resonance, no more wars producing rage, no more plagues producing despair, no more ambitious schemers producing Tsanch's preferred fuel, no more pleasure seekers feeding Slanesh. There would be only daemons, and daemons do not generate the kind of psychic output that sustains the Chaos Gods. They are expressions of that output, not sources of it. The Chaos Gods, having devoured everything, would have nothing left to feed on. The source would run dry. They would begin to diminish and eventually cease not through defeat, but through the simple metabolism of success. The victory condition for chaos is simultaneously the condition for its extinction. The Warhammer 40K lexicanum states this directly. No god can ever win the great game, for if the other ruinous powers were obliterated, the warp would be returned to its primordial state of placid serenity and chaos, as a primal force of the universe would cease to exist. What the Chaos Gods actually need, even if they would never acknowledge it, is for the conflict to continue forever. They need the Imperium to keep fighting and never completely fall. They need the Aldari to keep surviving at the very edge of extinction. They need mortal life to continue struggling, suffering, striving, and feeling, because all of that is the fuel that keeps them burning. The war is not the means to an end. The war is the end. It always has been. This creates a profound and persistent anxiety at the level of the Chaos Gods' most fundamental strategic interests. Khorne needs battles that produce blood and skulls endlessly, but battles that end the war entirely are catastrophic for him. Nurgle needs despair and the fear of death, but the actual extinction of mortal life would end Nurgle too. Tzeentch needs ambition and the endless generation of hope and scheming, but a galaxy where all scheming has been resolved produces no new threads to pull. Slaanesh needs desire and sensation, but a universe empty of conscious beings capable of experiencing any of these things has no use for the Dark Prince. The Great Game itself serves a stabilizing function in ways that are both elegant and grotesque. The eternal conflict among the four Dark Gods, the constant shifting alliances and betrayals, the surges of one power, followed by the coordinated opposition of the other three, ensures that no single dark power grows so dominant that it can threaten the stability of the warp as a whole. When Khorne's power surges, the others work against him. When Nurgle blooms, the others push back. The balance is never stable, always shifting, always producing the psychic turbulence and drama that generates more energy for all of them. It is a perfectly self-contained ecosystem of competitive divine entities, each preventing the others from winning while being prevented from winning themselves, the whole system sustained by the ongoing suffering and striving of the mortal realm outside it. The Great Game also means the Chaos Gods cannot coordinate against external threats in any sustained way. Their rare moments of unified action, the engineering of the Horus Heresy being the most significant example, always dissolve back into competition, because the nature of each dark god makes sustained cooperation impossible. Khorne cannot stop fighting. Tzeentch cannot stop scheming against his allies. Nurgle cannot resist encouraging entropy, even in alliances that serve him. Their unity always defeats itself from within. The deepest fear embedded in the nature of the Great Game is perhaps this: what if the game cannot go on? What if the conditions that make it possible the ongoing existence of a galaxy full of emotional, psychically resonant life are eroded by forces outside the Chaos Gods' control? The Tyranids don't care about the Great Game. The Necrons actively work to eliminate the conditions that make it possible. The Emperor's possible ascension would introduce a new player who was not interested in participating on its existing terms. Inead's birth would eliminate Slaanesh from the equation entirely. Each of these scenarios disrupts the Great Game in ways that the four Dark Gods cannot simply absorb and continue from. They cannot win, they cannot stop playing, and increasingly, they cannot be certain that the board they are playing on will continue to exist in its current form. Abaddon's 13 Black Crusades are perhaps the clearest expression of the paradox of Chaos's relationship with victory, and examining them reveals something about the structural logic of how Chaos operates in the 41st millennium that is easy to miss if you focus only on the dramatic surface details. The first 12 Black Crusades prior to the 13th and final one that shattered Cadia and opened the Great Rift are often characterized in the setting as failures. Abaddon could not break through Cadia. He was driven back. The Imperium held. And yet the War Master returned again and again, 12 times, across 10,000 years, each time causing devastation of enormous scale before being driven back. Why? Why would the greatest military commander in Chaos's service keep leading campaigns that, by the apparent metric of capturing Cadia, repeatedly failed? Because the metric of capturing Cadia was never the real objective. The Chaos Codex entries and supplementary lore make this clear for readers who look closely. The Black Crusades were not primarily military operations. They were ritual sacrifices. Each one poured enormous quantities of psychic energy into the Imperium through the concentrated violence of war, on a scale few events in the 41st millennium could match. Each one weakened the seals on the Eye of Terror incrementally, degraded the network of pylons Cadia depended on a little further, advanced the process of destabilizing the dimensional boundary in that region of space by measurable amounts. Each one was not a failure, but a payment, a contribution to a process that required many such contributions spread across millennia before it could produce the result Abaddon was actually working toward. The 13th Black Crusade achieved what the previous 12 had been building toward, not through superior tactics or overwhelming force or any new capability that had not existed before, but through the accumulated effect of everything that had preceded it, finally reaching a tipping point. The destruction of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift was not a sudden victory. It was the conclusion of a 10,000-year project that had always been moving in one direction. And even the Great Rift, which split the galaxy and produced the largest sustained demonic incursion in the history of the Imperium, has not destroyed the Imperium. The Chaos Gods produced their greatest victory in 10,000 years of trying, and the mortal civilization they were targeting still exists. Wounded, fractured, changed almost beyond recognition, but still fighting. Section 7. Enid and the Eldari Death God, Slaanesh's one true fear. Among all the fears we can identify for the Chaos Gods, none is more specific, more personal, or more directly existential for a single dark power than what the Eldari have been quietly building inside the infinity circuits of their craft worlds for 10,000 years. It is not a weapon in any traditional sense. It is not a technology or a military force. It is something closer to a prayer that has been building in power for 10 millennia, accumulating mass and weight and purpose with every generation that passes, with every Eldari soul that crosses the threshold between life and the careful preservation of the Spirit Stone system, with every craft world that maintains its integrity against the endless cruelties of the 41st millennium. Its name is Enid, and Slaanesh is afraid of it. To understand why, you need to go back to the fall of the Eldari. The Eldari Empire was, for millions of years, the dominant civilization in the galaxy. Their mastery of the warp was unparalleled. They were, in the most direct sense, the most psychically powerful mortal species the galaxy had ever produced. And that power, combined with the complacency of a civilization that had never faced a true existential threat, turned inward in the most catastrophic possible way. Their civilization began exploring extremes. Their pleasure cults discovered increasingly intense and disturbing forms of sensation. Their philosophers argued that because they could perceive and experience more than any other species, they had an obligation to explore the full range of what consciousness could contain, including its most terrible dimensions. All of this psychic weight, the accumulated residue of a galaxy-spanning empire's collective descent into unchecked sensation and excess, began building in the warp in ways that even the Eldari themselves did not understand until it was far too late. When Slaanesh finally opened its eyes for the first time, the Eldari Empire died in that instant. The Warhammer 40K wiki on the fall of the Eldari records that at last the entity suddenly came to life and was said to have taken its first breath, and this first breath instantly slew the overwhelming majority of the Eldari, who lived in the Empire, as their souls were inhaled by the entity. Billions of souls consumed, the Eye of Terror torn into reality, and the new god, bloated with the stolen essence of the most psychically powerful mortal race in history, turned immediately to hunt the Eldari's own gods, consuming most of the divine beings the race had worshipped for millions of years. The surviving Eldari adapted. They developed the Spirit Stones. They built the Infinity Circuits. They established the Path System, a structured approach to emotional and psychic development designed specifically to prevent the kind of unchecked feeling that had given birth to Slaanesh. And they lived with the knowledge that their god had a specific, personal, insatiable hunger for them. Because Slaanesh was born from their kind, the Eldari lore guide from Anima notes, every Eldari soul shines like a beacon to the Dark Prince, and an unprotected Eldari spirit that drifts free at death is dragged screaming into Slaanesh's domain to be devoured for eternity. It is one of the most perfectly terrible ironies in a universe not short on terrible ironies. But something else happened too, something the Eldari did not plan and did not fully understand for a long time. As the infinity circuits of the craft worlds filled with the accumulated dead millions of uploaded Aeldari consciousnesses held safe from Slaaneish's hunger in the wraithbone lattices of their wandering homes, the combined, psychic presence of those millions of souls began to coalesce. The dead of the craft worlds, held in communion within the infinity circuit, began developing a collective consciousness that was not the consciousness of any individual among them, something new. Something built from grief and courage and the fierce refusal of a dying people to surrender completely. This is what became Ynid, the Whispering God, the Aeldari God of the dead. The Warhammer 40K wiki on Ynid records that when the collective souls of the Asuryani fill the infinity circuits completely, they will join to form a new entity in the warp that will battle and subdue Slaanesh, so that all Aeldari spirits may once more be able to merge with it and form a single, balanced entity. Not a deity worshipped into existence through faith and ritual alone, but an entity that grew organically from the accumulated psychic weight of a civilization's dead, developing towards something with purpose and awareness and a very specific orientation. That orientation is the destruction of Slaanesh. It has been from the beginning, as surely as a river has an orientation toward the sea. The 1D6 Chan commentary on Ynid, drawing from the Gathering Storm narrative, notes that Ynid is described as genuinely anathema to the Chaos Gods, a distinction previously reserved for the Emperor of Mankind himself. That is remarkable. The fact that Ynid, still growing, not yet fully born, is placed in that same category, tells you something about what the Chaos Gods actually fear. Slaanesh cannot simply destroy the infinity circuits to prevent Ynid's growth. The craft worlds are scattered across the galaxy, each one a fortress designed with exactly this kind of threat in mind. More importantly, destroying the craft worlds would destroy the Aeldari, and the Aeldari are Slaanesh's favorite and most prized food source. The souls of the Aeldari burn like stars to the Dark Prince's perception, precisely because they are so psychically potent. Killing them all just to prevent Ynid would be burning down the orchard to prevent the fruit from being eaten by someone else. The immediate loss is total. The threat it prevents is gradual and distant. The logic fails. So Slaanesh is caught. The ongoing survival of the Aeldari is the ongoing construction of the weapon that will eventually destroy the Dark Prince. And the ongoing death of the Aeldari, the fulfillment of Slaanesh's appetite, is the fuel that builds Ynid faster. Either way, the Death God grows. There is no good outcome for Slaanesh in any scenario that involves the Aeldari continuing to exist. And in whatever passes for the private consciousness of a deity whose entire being is sensation and desire, that knowledge sits like a stone in still water, cold, immovable, immune to the pleasure that is supposed to be the Dark Prince's answer to everything. Ynid has partially awakened already. During the events of the Gathering Storm, the Whispering God's will briefly manifested in a figure called Yivrain during a moment of catastrophic spiritual energy release in Camorra. This partial birth has not yet given Ynid the power to destroy Slaanesh outright, but it has demonstrated that Ynid is real, that the process is working, that the math is building towards something. And in the Imperium, where the Dark Prince perceives all of this with senses no mortal can comprehend, that demonstration registered as something Slaanesh had not felt since before the fall of the Aeldari. Something new. Something that could not be consumed or seduced or outmaneuvered. Something that was, in the most fundamental sense, the Dark Prince's equal and opposite, the god of death to the god of excess. The patient accumulation of everything Slaanesh had taken, slowly assembling itself into the force that would take it all back. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, represent a particularly fascinating case study in the dynamics of Slaanesh's hunger and Ynid's growing influence. These are Aeldari who responded to the fall not by retreating to craft worlds and developing the path system, but by fleeing into the webway and establishing their city of Camorra there. Their solution to the problem of Slaanesh consuming their souls at death was not the Spirit Stone system, but something far more immediately practical and far darker. They simply sustained themselves by inflicting suffering on others. Every act of pain extracted from a captured slave, every scream wrested from a prisoner, every moment of terror imposed on the raiders' victims. All of this generates a flicker of sensation that the Drukhari absorb to keep themselves vibrant, to keep Slaanesh from noticing the particular flavor of their souls through the noise of so much other sensation. They are, in the most clinical description, addicts who sustain their habit by consuming the suffering of others, and their entire civilization is structured around ensuring a continuous supply. The Drukhari find Yniad deeply uncomfortable. The Whispering God's agenda, the weaponization of Aeldari death, the channeling of soul energy at the moment of passing runs entirely counter to the Drukhari model, which depends on souls not being processed through any spiritual framework, on the raw sensation of life persisting as long as possible in a body that is technically alive. Yniad's growing presence in the warp is perceived by many Drukhari as a threat to their way of existing, not merely to Slaanesh. A god of death, whose purpose is to claim and consolidate Aeldari souls, makes those souls less available for the kind of slow, sustained exploitation that powers Camorra. The Drukhari and the Ynnari are not natural allies, despite both being Aeldari. They have profoundly incompatible interests. And yet some Drukhari, particularly those for whom the slow horror of Camorra has become impossible to endure, have found their way to Yvraine and the Ynnari. The Gathering Storm narrative makes clear that even within the most cynical and hedonistic culture among the Aeldari, there are individuals for whom the accumulated weight of what they have done and what has been done to them produces something that resonates with Yniad's frequency, something close to a genuine desire to stop, to choose a different kind of relationship to death than the one Camorra offers. These individuals do not make the Drukhari as a culture into Yniad's allies, but they demonstrate that Yniad's appeal reaches even into the darkest corners of Aeldari experience, that the death god growing in the infinity circuits has relevance not only for the carefully managed souls of Craftworld, Aeldari, but for beings whose entire lives have been organized around the avoidance of exactly what Yniad represents. For Slaanesh, this is perhaps the most personally uncomfortable aspect of Yniad's growth. The Dark Prince feeds on sensation. It is the most immediate, most powerful form of sustenance available to the god of excess. And yet the deepest, most resonant experiences, the ones that produce the highest quality psychic energy, are not the superficial pleasures that the Drukhari extract from their victims, or that even the most elaborate human hedonist can generate. They are the experiences that come from things that matter, the love that is not merely pleasure, but genuine attachment, the grief that is not merely pain, but the evidence of something that was worth having, the courage that is not merely defiance, but the product of actually caring what happens. These experiences, the ones that have the most emotional depth and consequently the most psychic resonance, are the ones most closely associated with the authentic engagement with life and death that Yniad embodies. Slaanesh wants the quality sustenance, and Yniad is slowly claiming the very source of it. Section 8 Malal, the renegade god, and the horror of chaos, turning on itself. There is a name that even the most depraved servants of chaos speak quietly, and with something that might almost be called respect, if the emotion those words describe were not considerably closer to dread. The name is Malal, or Malice, depending on which era of the lore you draw from and which corner of Games Workshop's publishing history you are navigating. He was introduced in the very early days of the Warhammer universe, appearing in the Citadel Journal in the 1980s, before copyright complications specifically involving the writers John Wagner and Alan Grant, who had created the character, led to his being quietly removed from official canon. His current proxy in official lore is the minor deity called Malice, who shares his essential characteristics. But Malal's shadow persists in the nods that Games Workshop has scattered through its products over the decades, the Sons of Malice warband, who wear the black and white colors associated with the outcast god, the references to a renegade chaos deity in various background texts. What is Malal? He is the chaos god of chaos, or more precisely, he is the chaos god of chaos's own self-destructive tendency, the embodiment of the force that drives chaos to undermine itself, to turn against its own champions, to corrupt its own plans, to defeat its own victories through the simple expression of its own nature. Every time a chaos warband destroys itself in infighting before accomplishing its objective, every time a chaos champion is elevated to power and then immediately consumed by his own mutation or the capricious cruelty of his patron, Every time the four Chaos Gods cooperate for 5 minutes and then immediately betray each other because sustained cooperation is antithetical to who they are. In all of these moments, Malal is present. Malal is what those moments are manifestations of. And Malal grows stronger from each one. His followers, the doomed ones, dedicate themselves specifically to fighting other servants of chaos, not the forces of order, not the Imperium or the Eldari, or any conventional enemy, other worshippers of the dark gods. They hunt Khornate champions and Nurgle cultists and Scientian sorcerers. They destroy demonic artifacts and disrupt chaos rituals. They are soldiers of chaos who fight against chaos, dedicated to a god who exists specifically to ensure that chaos never achieves its potential. The Great Book of Despair, referenced in Malal's mythology, describes his worshippers as those who serve what they hate, who smile upon their own misfortune, who bear no love save for the damned. The other Chaos Gods fear Malal because he represents a principle they cannot fight in any conventional way. You cannot defeat an entity that is powered by your own failures and self-contradictions. The more chaos undermines itself, and chaos is, by its fundamental nature, always undermining itself, the stronger Malal becomes. The more the dark gods plot against each other, the more fuel they provide for the outcast god. It is a perfectly circular trap. Trying to eliminate Malal requires cooperation among the Chaos Gods, but cooperation among the Chaos Gods is itself a violation of the principle Malal embodies, which means it will inevitably fail, which means every attempt to destroy Malal only feeds him further. He cannot be defeated by the very nature of what he is. The lore surrounding Malal's fate is appropriately chaotic and unresolved. Some sources suggest the other four Chaos Gods eventually conspired to drive him out of the warp and into the material realm, casting him from the Imperium in a desperate attempt to remove the threat he posed to their eternal great game. The Warhammer Fantasy Wiki on Malal records the essence of this mythology. There is a name whispered quietly and with fear, even by the most depraved, the most evil, and the least sane of the worshippers of chaos. That name is Malice, the renegade god of chaos. In eons past, Malice was cast out from the bosom of chaos by the other chaos gods, or else abandoned them of his own volition, no one is sure which. His relationship to the other gods of chaos is a strange one. All chaos gods pursue purposes that are wholly their own, yet only Malice occupies a position so antithetic to those purposes that his very existence represents a threat to them. The Great Book of Despair passage about Malal has been quoted with appropriate reverence by those who love this corner of the lore. It speaks of a being that turned its heart against the gods and fled into the chambers of space, of followers as those who serve what they hate, who smile upon their own misfortune. And it concludes that when a warrior's heart turns to Malal, all gods of chaos grow fearful, and the laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space. The laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space. Not a triumphant proclamation, laughter in a tomb. The sound of something finding genuine amusement in the situation. It inhabits a universe where the forces of chaos are so fundamentally committed to their own self-destruction that they have created, through the simple expression of their nature, a god dedicated specifically to ensuring they never win. And that god finds this genuinely funny. The Chaos Gods cannot escape Malal because the thing Malal embodies is not a weakness they could choose to correct. It is who they are. Chaos is self-defeating by definition. The great game is self-defeating by design. The competition among the ruinous powers is self-defeating by necessity. And the entity that feeds on that self-defeating tendency will always have something to eat, as long as the Chaos Gods exist at all. Malal is not an external threat in the conventional sense. He is a consequence. He is the shadow chaos casts when it looks at itself honestly, and that shadow has a name and a purpose and a sense of humor about the whole affair. There is a broader implication to Malal's existence that is worth drawing out, because it applies not just to the Chaos Gods, but to the fundamental architecture of the warp itself. If chaos, the undifferentiated, self-defeating, constantly undermining tendency of psychic energy to work against itself, is basic enough to the structure of the Imperium that it produced a god specifically embodying that tendency, then that tendency is not a correctable flaw in the system. It is the system. The warp is chaotic, not because the Chaos Gods made it so, but because the Chaos Gods emerged from it that way. The self-defeating quality that Malal represents is not a bug introduced into an otherwise functional system. It is the texture of the system itself, expressed most completely in a being whose entire existence is its demonstration. This has implications for how we think about any scenario in which chaos might be definitively defeated or contained. If you eliminate the 4 Chaos Gods somehow, through whatever mechanism you do not eliminate the chaotic nature of the warp, the Imperium would remain what it is, a dimension of pure psychic energy, turbulent and unpredictable, shaped by the emotional output of mortal life. New entities might emerge from it, different entities. Entities shaped by whatever emotional frequencies dominate after a hypothetical fall of the 4 Chaos Gods. But the fundamental unpredictability, the tendency towards self-defeat and contradiction, the quality that Malal most perfectly embodies this would remain, because it is not a consequence of the 4 Chaos Gods' existence. It is a property of the medium from which they emerged. Malal, or whatever fragment of Malal's essence, persists in the lore as malice, is therefore not merely an inconvenience for the 4 Chaos Gods. He is a reminder that they did not create the thing they are made of, and cannot fully control it. They emerged from a dimension whose most fundamental characteristic is the subversion of order and the undermining of sustained intention. And the most honest God in that dimension is the one who embodies that characteristic completely, who makes no pretense of building anything lasting, who exists to ensure that whatever is built gets torn down, and who finds the situation not tragic but genuinely and somewhat wickedly amusing, because, of course it is. What else would be the appropriate response to a universe that is, at its most fundamental level, a system designed to undermine itself? The laughter of the outcast, God fills the tomb of space, not because Malal has won, but because winning was never the point. Section 9. Mortal courage, faith, and the small fears with cosmic implications. We have talked about the great cosmic forces that threaten the Chaos Gods, the Tyranids and their alien silence, the Necrons and their ancient technology, the Emperor and his psychic resistance, the Great Game's paradoxical self-limitation, the specific dread of Yniad building in the craft worlds, the uncomfortable mirror that Malal holds up to chaos. These are enormous, galaxy-scale threats, but there is something smaller that deserves attention, threaded through the setting's most powerful moments. It is this: the Chaos Gods cannot feed on every emotion that mortal beings produce. Their power has a specific shape, and there are human experiences that fall outside that shape in ways that matter. The Chaos Gods feed on specific categories of emotion. Khorne feeds on rage and the desire to kill. Nurgle feeds on despair and the fear of death. Tzeentch feeds on ambition and obsessive desire for knowledge. Slaanesh feeds on sensation and pleasure and obsessive longing. Within those domains, they are almost unlimited in their ability to exploit mortal psychology. But there are emotional states that do not map neatly onto any of those categories, states the Chaos Gods cannot easily monetize. The simplest and most powerful of these is a combination that sounds straightforward, but is extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Clear-eyed hope, combined with willingness to act on it at great personal cost, without self-deception and without the naive expectation that things will simply work out, not the desperate prayer of someone whose fear is already feeding Nurgle, not the ambition of someone whose desire to make things better is already shading toward Tzeentchian obsession, but the genuinely costly hope of a person who understands exactly how terrible their situation is and chooses to act in the service of something good anyway, not because they expect to win, but because the alternative is to become something they don't want to be. This is what the Chaos Gods cannot corrupt without first transforming it into something else. They can take ambition and twist it into Tzeentchian obsession that serves only itself. They can take love and twist it into Slaaneshi possessiveness that destroys its object. They can take righteous anger and channel it toward Khornate bloodlust. They can take acceptance of mortality and strip it of whatever dignity it might have contained to feed Nurgle. But the genuine article, the authentic version of these things that hasn't been twisted yet, is hostile territory for them. It produces the wrong kind of psychic resonance. It does not flow naturally into the patterns the Dark Gods are built to consume. The Sisters of Battle offer one concrete expression of this principle. These warriors have no genetic enhancement beyond baseline humanity. They have no formally trained psychic abilities, and yet they are among the most effective fighters against demonic forces in the galaxy, and the explanation given in the lore is not technological, it is faith. The genuine, deeply felt religious devotion of warriors who have dedicated everything to a cause they believe in completely generates a psychic quality in the warp that the Chaos Gods cannot easily exploit or redirect into sustenance. It does not feed them, it resists them. In moments of great devotion, this resistance becomes active, the miracle effects that the lore describes, spontaneous events that operate in direct opposition to warp-based phenomena. These moments emerge from the emotional state of people who believe completely and are willing to die for what they believe. Grey Knights operate on a related principle. These Space Marine psychers interact with the warp directly, which in theory makes them just as vulnerable to chaos corruption as any other psychic warrior. But the Grey Knight's practice involves an extraordinary commitment to purity of intent, the genuine, ongoing maintenance of a psychic state that is hostile to chaos. The lore suggests that it is this sincere will of warriors who dedicate themselves wholly to opposition that makes Grey Knight weapons so specifically effective against demons. The weapon becomes an extension of the will of the warrior wielding it, and that will is something daemons find actively hostile to be near. It burns them in ways that mere physical damage cannot. What both of these examples point toward is a principle embedded in the fundamental logic of what the Chaos Gods are and how they sustain themselves. The emotions they feed on are specifically the distorted, corrupted, unresolved versions of things that, in their healthy form, look quite different. Rage without purpose feeds corn. Rage in service of genuine justice, properly resolved and expressed, does not feed him in the same way. Fear of death without any anchor becomes Nurgle's food. Fear of death that spurs someone to create something lasting, to care for others while they still can, to use the awareness of mortality as a goad toward genuine living. This does not feed Nurgle the same way. Desire that loops in on itself feeds Slaanesh. Desire that is expressed and then released in favor of genuine contentment does not. These distinctions are small and fragile and impossibly difficult to maintain in the perpetual war that defines the 41st millennium, but they exist. And in a setting that often presents itself as entirely without hope, that existence matters. Not as a solution to the problem of chaos, nothing in the current era is a solution to the problem of chaos, but as a reminder that the Chaos Gods' control over mortal life is not as total or as inevitable as the bleakest readings of the setting imply. The Dark Gods have shaped, encouraged, exploited, and corrupted the emotional landscape of the galaxy for tens of thousands of years, but they have not conquered it entirely. There are corners of mortal experience that resist them. There are people who, in the moments that matter most, produce something they cannot use, and that remainder, small as it is, fragile as it is something they have never been able to eliminate completely. Section 10. What happens if the galaxy goes silent? The ultimate terror. Bring all of it together now. Pull every thread we have explored and follow them to where they converge. The Tyranids approach from outside the galaxy in numbers that strain comprehension. Their fleets consume world after world, leaving nothing behind, no life, no emotional resonance, no psychic signature, no contribution to the warp whatsoever. The shadow in the warp rolls before them, suppressing demonic activity across entire sectors, cutting star systems off from the Imperium's influence as thoroughly as if someone had sealed a door and swallowed the key. The Chaos Gods' watch systems they have exploited for generations simply go dark. The emotional output of billions of lives simply stops, not redirected, not transformed, gone. Multiple hive fleets are pressing into the galaxy simultaneously. Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and others attacking from different vectors across the galactic plane. Each one strips worlds clean. Each consumed planet is a planet that no longer generates psychic resonance. Each eliminated species is a species whose emotional life no longer sustains the Imperium. The cumulative effect across decades and centuries is a galaxy progressively quieter in the specific psychic frequencies the Chaos Gods depend on. The math is slow, but it is relentless, and it does not negotiate. At the same time, the Necron awakening continues. Thousands of tomb worlds, across dozens of dynasties, with their own incomprehensible agendas, are coming online. Anti-psychic technology, 60 million years old, is being reactivated. Where Necron influence spreads, the warp thins. The areas of space where chaos can directly act are progressively shrinking, pushed back by infrastructure built specifically to negate what the chaos gods are. The pariah nexus grows. Other suppression zones expand. The ancient silence the Necrons were designed to impose is returning to the galaxy, one sector at a time, with the patience of a civilization that has been asleep for 60 million years and is in no hurry to rush anything. And then there is the Emperor, sitting on his throne, not dead and not finally dying, accumulating 10,000 years of slow and agonizing transformation. The failing technology of the Golden Throne making the whole situation more unstable, more certain to resolve in some definitively different way, and the Chaos Gods cannot be certain which way that resolution will go. A dead Emperor produces one set of consequences. An ascended Emperor produces something they have never faced and cannot fully predict. Neither outcome is comfortable for them. Both are drawing closer. Beyond all of this, Inead grows. Quietly, in the wraithbone corridors of craft worlds scattered across 1,000 light-years, the accumulated dead of the Eldari are building something with a specific purpose and a specific target. Each Eldari who passes adds weight. The math is slow but inexorable. Slaanesh perceives the growing presence with the sensitivity that makes Eldari souls so precious to the Dark Prince, and cannot stop it, and cannot look away, and cannot find any scenario where it ends well for she who thirsts. Underlying all of it, the great game continues, as it always has and presumably always will, except that the conditions sustaining the great game are not as guaranteed as they have always seemed. The Chaos Gods devote the vast majority of their attention to each other, because that is what they are built to do. The moment-to-moment jockeying for psychic dominance within the Imperium demands more of their presence than any single external threat. This means that as multiple existential challenges converge on the conditions of their existence simultaneously, the Dark Gods are structurally unable to respond coherently to any of them. They are four entities whose constitutionally mandated response to every crisis is to also fight each other about it. It is not a strategic choice. It is their nature. And their nature, in this particular moment, is working against them. What would the ultimate fear of the Chaos Gods actually look like, distilled to its essence? If you could point to a single scenario that represented the convergence of everything that threatens them, what would it be? It would not be a final battle, not a glorious last war where the forces of order rally and destroy the ruinous powers in some climactic engagement. The Chaos Gods do not fear. That kind of ending would require the mortal races to fight each other less and cooperate more than they are capable of sustaining for any meaningful length of time, and the violence of such a campaign would feed the Dark Gods enormously on the way to it. The apocalyptic war of all against chaos would itself be chaos's greatest feast. What they fear is something quieter and far more strange, a galaxy that goes silent, not through any single dramatic event, not through any heroic victory or catastrophic defeat, but through the slow convergence of multiple forces that none of them can control. The Tyranids consuming the outer worlds, while the Necrons suppress the warp in the inner ones. The Emperor ascending while Inead awakens. The mortal races developing under the pressure of existential threat and the desperate need to survive a quality of emotional response that feeds chaos less efficiently. That is defined more by the difficult hope and genuine courage we discussed earlier than by the easier, more pliable emotions of fear and rage and desire. A galaxy that is still alive, still fighting, still generating psychic energy, but generating it in shapes that the Chaos Gods were never designed to consume. It would not happen overnight. In the time frame of the 40,000 setting, it might not be perceivable within the span of a human lifetime. But the Chaos Gods, who perceive time differently than mortals do, who see the long arcs of history and fate from within the Imperium, can feel trajectories, and certain trajectories in the current narrative, if followed far enough, converge toward a point where the galaxy's output of usable psychic energy begins to decline in ways that have no historical precedent. The conditions that have sustained the great game for tens of thousands of years are not fixed, they are contingent. And they are under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, for the first time in the history of the setting. This is the texture of the ultimate fear. Not being killed, not being defeated in any dramatic sense, but being made progressively smaller, being diminished, slowly, by the accumulation of forces that resist them, and forces that ignore them, and forces that starve them, and forces that were born from the very same suffering they inflicted. Being left behind by a galaxy that changes in ways they were never equipped to handle. A galaxy that contains things they cannot corrupt, cannot ignore, cannot destroy, and cannot integrate into the great game. A galaxy that, in certain theoretical futures, stops producing the specific kind of suffering they were built to consume. The Chaos Gods are vast. They are ancient. They are, in most meaningful senses of the word, invincible. But they are not inevitable. They are adapted to a particular kind of galaxy, full of psychically resonant mortal life, generating specific categories of emotional output in specific quantities. Change those conditions, and the conditions are being changed, slowly and from multiple directions, and the adaptation becomes a vulnerability. The strength becomes a constraint. The invincibility turns out to have been contingent all along on circumstances that were never guaranteed to last forever. The Great Devourer does not fear them. The Silent King does not bow to them. The Anathema does not yield to them. The Death God of the Aeldari does not acknowledge their authority. The Outcast God sits in the tomb of space and laughs at the elegant trap they have built for themselves. And somewhere in the billions of human hearts and Aeldari spirits, and whatever it is that orcs feel that isn't quite joy, but isn't quite anything else either, somewhere in all of that persistent, practically pointless refusal to simply give up and become what the dark gods need them to be, there is something the ruinous powers cannot digest. In the lore of Warhammer 40,000, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, there are also, quietly and persistently, the things that make the gods grow a little less certain of their laughter, the things that make the darkness a little less absolute. Not because hope is easy or guaranteed or even particularly likely in the context of this universe, but because it exists, because it persists, because every civilization that has ever tried to survive against impossible odds has left behind something that chaos cannot fully claim or digest or destroy. That remainder, that stubborn, impossible, practically pointless but never quite eliminated remainder, is what the Chaos Gods are afraid of in the end. Not any single force or weapon or hero, but the cumulative weight of everything that refuses, despite all the evidence and all the pressure and all the darkness, to stop being itself. The Chaos Gods have consumed billions of souls and corrupted entire civilizations and twisted some of the finest warriors humanity ever produced into servants of the dark. They have toppled empires and broken armies and bent the course of history to suit their eternal great game. And still, in the corners of the galaxy where the light reaches, and in the hearts of beings who have no reason left to hope, something refuses to cooperate with the narrative they are writing. Something insists on being real in a universe that has every reason to produce only despair. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, that refusal is small and fragile and vastly outnumbered, but it is there. And the Chaos Gods, in whatever way they can be said to know anything, know it. And that knowledge, quiet, persistent, impossible to eliminate, is the closest thing to unease that beings without a mortal heart can feel. The Space Marines themselves are worth examining briefly as a phenomenon that the Chaos Gods have had mixed success with, because their track record with Space Marines is more complicated than casual discussion sometimes suggests. The creation of the Space Marine legions was, from the Chaos Gods' perspective, the production of a new and significant psychic presence in the galaxy, beings of enormous martial capability, psychic resonance above baseline human levels, and deep emotional investment in the outcomes of the wars they fought. The Horus Heresy demonstrated that Space Marines can absolutely be corrupted, that the process that produces one of the most capable warriors in the galaxy also produces, in some cases, a being with a specific kind of pride and betrayal and rage that the Chaos Gods can exploit with devastating results. But the heresy also demonstrated the limits of that exploitation. The Space Marines who did not fall, the Ultramarines, the Blood Angels, the Space Wolves, the Imperial Fists and their successors, and all the others resisted, not because they were immune to the emotions, chaos, exploits, but because something in the structure of their loyalty and their identity was more resistant than the Dark Gods anticipated. The Space Marines who remained loyal were not beings without pride or rage or grief. They were beings who had organized those things in a direction the Chaos Gods found much harder to redirect. The loyalty to the Emperor, the bond to their brothers, the identity invested in being something specific, these were not weaknesses that Chaos could easily pry open. They were the wrong shape for the tools Chaos had brought to the job. Every Space Marine chapter that has maintained its integrity across 10,000 years of perpetual war, every Astartes who has faced demonic temptation in close combat and rejected it, every Psyker who has gone into the warp and come back with their sanity intact and their will uncorrupted, each of these is a small but real contribution to the pattern of resistance we are describing. Each one generates, in the warp, the specific psychic quality of a mind that has been offered the easy path and refused it. The accumulated weight of those refusals across 10,000 years, and billions of people across the Imperium who will never be as dramatic or as visible as a Space Marine, but who make the same fundamental choice in their own circumstances. This is something the Chaos Gods have been fighting against for the entire history of the Fawn, Imperium, and they have not yet won that fight completely. The darkness in this universe is not total, and nothing makes the Dark Gods more uncomfortable than that simple, persistent, infuriating fact. There is one more thread to pull before we close, and it is one that the setting itself handles with unusual delicacy. The question of what the Chaos Gods do with the awareness of their own vulnerability, to the extent that they have any such awareness at all. Tzeentch is the only one of the four who might plausibly be said to perceive the full strategic situation. He is the god of knowledge and planning, and his perception of fate and the threads of causality gives him something approaching, a view of the long game that the other three dark gods completely lack. Khorne does not think in centuries. Nurgle thinks in cycles of decay that have nothing to do with strategic awareness. Slaanesh thinks in sensation and does not project far enough forward to see the implications of trajectories. Tzeentch alone has the cognitive architecture to perceive the paradox of the Great Game, the threat of the Tyranids, the implications of the Necron awakening, and the trajectory of Yniad's growth, and to understand what they collectively mean. And here's the terrifying thing. Tzeentch might be doing something about it, or he might be preventing the other three from doing anything about it, or both simultaneously. He might be engineering the very scenarios that threaten the Dark Gods, because the schemes those scenarios produce are more interesting to him than the eventual stable victory that would end the game he loves more than any outcome of it. Tzeentch does not want chaos to win in any final sense. He wants the game to go on. He wants the scheming to continue. And a galaxy where every threat is cleanly resolved and chaos reigns supreme is a galaxy where the scheming stops, which is the one outcome Tzeentch genuinely cannot bear. He would, if the logic of his nature is followed far enough, prefer a galaxy where the Chaos Gods are constantly threatened and constantly scheming in response to a galaxy where they are safe and have nothing to plot about. If this is the case, and it can only ever be speculation, because Tzeentch's plans are not the kind of thing that resolves into clear conclusions, then some portion of the Chaos God's vulnerability is self-inflicted in a very specific Tzeentchian way. The God of Change is actively maintaining the conditions that threaten all four of them, because the threat is more interesting than safety. He is keeping the game dangerous, because a dangerous game is more worth playing. And in doing so, he is serving his own nature completely, while arguably betraying the collective interests of the ruinous powers in the most elegant and most irresponsible way imaginable. Which is, of course, exactly what Tzeentch does. It is what Tzeentch is. Consider what this means for the future of the 41st millennium. We have a galaxy where the Tyranids are consuming the edges, where the Necrons are waking up in the middle, where the Emperor is changing on his throne in ways that cannot be predicted, where Ynid is growing in the craft world circuits, where the great game is simultaneously the Chaos God's greatest strength and their most profound structural liability, where the moments of genuine mortal courage and faith keep producing psychic output that cannot be directed into the dark god's sustenance, where a renegade god laughs from the margins at the elegant futility of the whole enterprise, and where Tzeentch watches all of it with something that, in a being capable of lesser things, would be called delight. The 40,000 setting is sometimes described as a grimdark universe, with no hope and no possibility of meaningful victory for any side. This is too simple. It is a universe where the conditions for hope are present, but where hope is extraordinarily difficult, where the things that could theoretically save the galaxy exist, but are fragile, embattled, uncertain, and surrounded by forces that would prefer they did not exist at all. That is not the absence of hope. That is hope in its most honest form. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, not easy, but present, not absent. The Chaos Gods fear the convergence of all of this, because the convergence represents the possibility, not the certainty, but the genuine possibility of a galaxy that escapes their grip, not through any single heroic act or any climactic confrontation between the forces of order and the forces of chaos, but through the slow, painful, uncertain process of a galaxy that changes in ways they were not built to handle. A galaxy where their food is being eaten by something that doesn't share it with them, where their influence is being suppressed by technology that doesn't acknowledge their existence, where the being they struck down on the Golden Throne becomes something different from what they left him as, where the god they inadvertently created when they consumed the Eldari is becoming large enough to be their equal, and where the mortal beings they have exploited for so long keep, despite everything, refusing to stop being themselves. That refusal is the deepest fear of all. The Chaos Gods can be threatened by Tyranids and Necrons, because those are external forces that operate outside the system the Dark Gods inhabit. But the refusal of mortal consciousness to entirely surrender its own character, that threat comes from inside the system they depend on. It comes from the thing they feed on. It comes from the same place they came from. And it is impossible to eliminate without eliminating the food source that keeps them alive. The Chaos Gods cannot kill the hope of mortal beings without killing the mortal beings, and they cannot kill the mortal beings without killing themselves. So the hope persists. Small, fragile, outnumbered, and absolutely irreplaceable. The most powerful beings in the galaxy cannot stamp it out, because stamping it out would be the last thing they ever did. That is the final shape of what makes the Chaos Gods afraid, not the weapons pointed at them from outside. Those are real threats, and we have walked through all of them. But at the deepest level, what they fear is this. They are not as separate from the mortal realm as they appear. They are products of it. They feed on it. And somewhere in the thing they feed on, something keeps surviving that was never supposed to be there in a universe with only war and the laughter of thirsting gods. Something quiet and persistent and utterly refusing to cooperate. Something that does not know it is a threat to the most powerful entities in the galaxy. Something that simply continues, as consciousness always continues, to be itself. The darkness is vast. The Chaos Gods are old and terrible, and vast and powerful, beyond the ability of any mortal mind to fully comprehend. But the galaxy is not silent yet. The light, such as it is, still burns. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is something. One final thought, before we close, about what all of this means for the mortal beings caught in the middle of it. The Chaos Gods are afraid of things that are, from the perspective of any individual human, or Eldari, or Orc, living in the 41st millennium, completely beyond their personal influence or concern. The Tyranid hive mind does not respond to individual acts of courage. The Necron awakening does not accelerate or decelerate based on what any particular human decides to believe. Ennead's growth is not meaningfully affected by any single Eldari's choices, even though it is collectively built from all of them. The Emperor's transformation on the throne is not something any mortal being can act on directly. And yet, the final and perhaps most important point in all of this is that the things the Chaos Gods fear are not just large-scale cosmic forces. They are also the cumulative expression of individual choices made across billions of lives in circumstances where the easier path was always available. The shadow in the warp does not care about individual choices, but the faith that resists it is made of them. Iliad is not the product of any single decision, but of millions of decisions, made by people who chose the spirit stone over the alternative, the path over the chaos that birthed Slanesh, the careful preservation of something worth preserving over the easier surrender. The emperor persists on the throne, partly because of individuals, countless individuals, 1,000 of them every single day, who were brought forward and who, in whatever way was available to them, gave what they had to give to the light rather than the dark. The Chaos Gods are afraid of these things, not as individual acts, but as patterns, as evidence that the mortal realm will not simply become what they need it to be, that consciousness in all its forms retains a stubborn tendency to reach for something that exceeds its immediate circumstances, that the darkness they have cultivated so carefully is never quite complete. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the laughter is not quite as loud as it would like to be, because somewhere in the noise of 10,000 years of unending catastrophe, something keeps whispering back. Not victory, not salvation, just refusal. Just the simple, persistent, infuriating, magnificent refusal to stop. That refusal is what the Chaos Gods are afraid of. And in a universe this dark, that refusal is everything. Think for a moment about what it means to have fears when you are one of the 4 most powerful entities in the galaxy. The Chaos Gods do not experience vulnerability the way a mortal does. They do not wake in the dark with their hearts racing. They do not lie awake, cataloging things that could go wrong. They do not carry the weight of anxiety in any form that resembles human experience. And yet what we have walked through across this exploration is a genuine catalog of things that threaten them in ways they cannot simply overcome through the expression of their power. The Tyranids are not weaker than the Chaos Gods. The Necrons are not corruptible by them. The Emperor is not finished. Iliad is not stoppable. Malal is not defeatable on conventional terms. The paradox of the Great Game is not solvable. The refusal of mortal consciousness to fully cooperate with the Dark Gods' preferred emotional landscapes is not eliminable. Each one of these is a real constraint on what the most powerful entities in the Warhammer universe can accomplish. And collectively, in the 41st millennium, all of them are active simultaneously in a way that has no historical precedent. The galaxy has never before been home to all of these threats at once, converging from different directions, operating through different mechanisms, each one pressing against the conditions of chaos's existence from a different angle and in a different way that makes no single response adequate to address all of them together. The Chaos Gods are not going to be defeated by any one hero, or any one battle, or any one campaign. That is not how this universe works, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the architecture of their vulnerability, the specific shape of what threatens them and why, tells us something important about the logic of the 41st millennium's world. It tells us that the darkness, for all its immensity, is not as absolute as it presents itself, that the invincibility is contingent, that the eternal, grinding, purposeless war that defines this universe is not simply the inevitable expression of forces too large and too powerful for anything to meaningfully threaten. There are things that threaten even the largest and most powerful entities in the setting, and those things are real and present and operating right now in the events of the current narrative. The Chaos Gods feed on suffering, and the deepest, most comprehensive threat to their existence is a universe that changes in ways that make their specific variety of suffering harder to generate and consume. A universe where the food changes its flavor in ways the predators were never designed to handle. A universe where the silence creeps in from the edges and the old emotional certainties of a mortal realm built for exploitation begin, slowly and without announcement, to shift. That shift is what keeps the Dark Gods from laughing quite as freely as they once did. That is the shape of what they fear. Not the sword at their throat, but the slow change in the air. The sense that the universe they were built for and built themselves to exploit is not quite the same universe it was 10,000 years ago, and that the difference, accumulated over the centuries ahead, may eventually amount to something they were never equipped to face. There is one category of threat to the Chaos Gods we have not yet named explicitly, and it sits so close to the surface of everything we have discussed that it deserves a direct statement. It is this: time itself. Not time as an abstract philosophical concept, but time as the medium through which all of these other threats compound and accumulate. The Necron awakening is slow, but it has 60 million years of technological investment behind it, and it does not stop. Enid's growth is patient, but 10,000 years have already passed, and the Whispering God is already partially awake. The Emperor's transformation is uncertain, but the trajectory is real, and the technology sustaining his current state is failing in ways that will eventually resolve. The Tyranid fleets consume slowly relative to the size of the galaxy, but they do not stop, and they do not tire, and they do not lose interest. The Chaos Gods have existed for tens of thousands of years. From within the Imperium, they perceive time differently than mortals do, but they are not immune to the consequences of long duration. And the long duration of the 41st millennium is producing a convergence that has no precedent in the history of the warp. The galaxy is full of things that are building toward something. The Necrons are building toward a reclaimed empire. Enid is building toward a birth. The Emperor is building toward an ascension or a final death. The Tyranids are building toward a consumed galaxy. The mortal races are building toward what? Nobody knows. But they keep building. They keep surviving. They keep refusing to simply collapse into the pattern the Chaos Gods need them to maintain. Every year that passes without any of these threats resolving is another year in which all of them continue to develop. Another year in which Enid's weight increases. Another year in which Necron pylons operate. Another year in which the Emperor continues to be whatever he is becoming. Another year in which the Tyranid fleets eat another handful of worlds at the galaxy's edges, and the silence behind them deepens. Time is not neutral in the 41st millennium. It is working against the Chaos Gods in slow and sustained and cumulative ways that their moment-to-moment focus on the great game prevents them from fully addressing. They are extraordinarily powerful entities caught in the wrong relationship with the long arc of their own era. And the long arc does not care how powerful they are. It simply continues. That is the final and perhaps the most quietly terrifying fear of the Chaos Gods. Not any single threat, however formidable, but the accumulation of threats that time produces when a universe contains things that are bigger and older and stranger than even the darkest powers that inhabit it. The galaxy is old. The universe is older. And patience, in the end, is a weapon that even gods cannot outlast. If you made it all the way through this one, that genuinely means something. This is one of the longer and more demanding pieces of lore content I've put together, and sitting with it from beginning to end takes real patience. If this is the kind of content you come here for, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Drop a like if this one hit the way you wanted it to, and leave a comment with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Honestly, one of the best parts of making this is finding out that someone was listening in the early hours with the rain outside, or on a long drive, or winding down after a shift somewhere I've never been. The idea that lore like this reaches places like that's worth something to me. See you in the next one. This universe is enormous, and there is a lot more of it left to explore.